So it ain't nothing about nobody having to have no new format, this is the way things, this new protocol, none of that shit, okay? And the reason why is because we know that the preachers of the black communities have not been doing anything but putting the noose around all of the black community people, the recipients of every preacher, every sermon that any of these Christian preachers have given to any melanated person on this planet was nothing but an administration of a lethal dose of death. So this is not something new that they had to be briefed on. They already been briefed on this shit hundreds of years ago.
They also held contests in which awards would be given to the ministers who came up with the best pro-eugenic sermons on their own. This approach proved so effective that an almost identical strategy would be adopted by the American abortion lobby.
In January of 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion on demand throughout the United States, and almost immediately, the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights was formed.
Less than a year earlier, the following conversation had taken place in the Oval Office of the White House. It began on the 30th of March, 1972, and continued 4 days later on the 3rd of April. This is an actual recording of that conversation. The speakers are the President of the United States, Republican Richard Nixon, and members of his senior staff.
The majority of people in Colorado voted for abortion. I think the majority of people in Michigan voted for abortion. I think in both cases, well, certainly in Michigan, they will vote for it because they think it was going to be important down here, the little black aspects. As I told you, we talked about it earlier, that a hell of a lot of people want to control the legal basket down this matter here. There's a little bit of talking about we're talking really about not allowing for it, you know. But the people in what we call our class control their population. Sometimes they'll have math in the 67, 89. But it's exception. The people who don't control their math are people that the people that should have kids. Now that's my population. My county in the city of San Francisco is long 3,000. Right after World War II, the war that represents 30% of the population of San Francisco.
And all this is because white people are not reproducing, all right? If white people were reproducing, there would have been no need for their power structure to replace them with Mexicans, all right? Because that's the only reason why they did that, because the white people declined in numbers and they couldn't keep up with the workforce demand. So they all had to get shafted because they're sterile. There's a low rate of white babies being born on the earth. And this is the reason why you got these crazy ass white men walking around talking about they want to destroy 80% of the population on earth. That's like their little secret code. All the white people on the planet know that 80% means the black people. So they're all sit they little, maybe 7 of them on the whole planet compared to the other 93 people, and they little 7 ass want to murder the other 93 people and then have the whole earth to themselves. Now you're talking about ego. I mean, that's just too much. But listen, let's wake up to the fact that the universe has already planned on eradicating you guys because of all this horrible shit we're looking at right now. So it's a good time for everyone to fix their karma. And don't even think about this bullshit that you think is going to continue with black people being all victimized and everything. It's not. And I'm not trying to be cocky or bad or anything. I'm just doing what I was sent here to do. I'm giving you guys information. Know this. The universe is getting ready to deal with all the people responsible for this bullshit that I'm showing you right now. Do not get yourself involved with any of the continuance or the perpetuation of these type of activities because heads are getting ready to roll. Know that. Everybody better be trying to find love in their heart so you can erase the bad karma that I'm sure we all have right now already.
The Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights was originally created with the financial backing of John Rockefeller, and its current president is an African American who was once appointed to the Washington, D.C. City Council by Richard Nixon. In the early 1990s, the organization changed its name and is today known as the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice.
In 1969, a meeting of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO, proposed that an American Population Commission be created with a, quote, large budget for propaganda, unquote. 4 months later, Republican President Richard Nixon signed legislation establishing the Commission on Population Growth and the American Future. The bill authorizing this new initiative had been passed with overwhelming support from congressional Democrats and was chaired by John Rockefeller. The executive director of the project was to be Dr. Charles F. Weston, who was also a member of both the American Eugenics Society and Planned Parenthood's National Advisory Council.
Another member of this new commission was Dr. Joseph Beasley. In the 1960s, Beasley oversaw an aggressive eugenics program that concentrated on black neighborhoods in New Orleans with the stated intention of lowering welfare costs. This project would eventually be described by Planned Parenthood President Alan Guttmacher as the #1 success story in the history of American birth control movement. It also led to Beasley being elected chairman of the board of Planned Parenthood in 1970. Then in 1975, Beasley was sent to federal prison for conspiring to defraud the U.S. government of $778,000 that had been allocated for the project. In court, a local black civil rights activist named Sherman Copeland testified that he took payoffs from Beasley for helping him to convince residents of the targeted neighborhoods that birth control was not black genocide.
In 1969, William H. Draper was appointed to represent the United States on the United Nations Population Commission. Draper had once proposed that government-sponsored population control efforts among the poor be accelerated in order to deal with racial unrest and to cure what he called the ghetto problem. Draper was on the governing body of Planned Parenthood and had personally raised more than $4 million for the organization.
That same year, a New York Times article about Planned Parenthood said the organization's board of directors was dominated by people who were both white and wealthy. The article went on to quote one of those board members as saying, "What it all comes down to is that we want the poor to stop breeding while we retain our freedom to have large families. It's strictly a class point of view."
There's ample evidence that government programs designed for poor black folks emphasize birth control and abortion availability, both measures obviously designed to limit black population. Media Dick Gregory, Ebony Magazine, 1971.
It takes little imagination to see that the unborn black baby is the real object of many abortionists. Irma Clardy Craven, Chairman, Minneapolis Commission on Human Rights, and Secretary of the Urban League.
It was not until the mid-60s that blacks began to realize that what was called urban renewal was in fact what one black city planner labeled Negro removal. Roy Ayers, National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality, Ebony Magazine, 1974.
To a large and growing number of 1960s civil rights activists, it became obvious that family planning was just a code word for abortion and birth control, and that it was being pushed by the government as a way to avoid putting money into the black community. This conclusion was reinforced by statements like those of Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson, who in June of 1965 stated that every $5 the government spent on population control was worth more than $100 invested in economic growth. Then, at the urging of Republican Congressman George Bush, Johnson became the first U.S. president to endorse federal funding for birth control. In 1966, he would also accept Planned Parenthood's highest award for his policies, pushing family planning on foreign countries.
It's at about this same time that political leaders from both parties began to increase their demands that aid to the poor, whether abroad or within the United States, be tied to birth control. In 1965, former Republican President Dwight Eisenhower complained that the United States was spending money to slow the population growth of responsible families, while at the same time providing financial incentives for ignorant, feeble-minded, and lazy people to have more babies. He said that history would rightly condemn the United States if we didn't link welfare to family planning. At that time, Eisenhower was the co-chairman of a Planned Parenthood fundraising campaign along with former Democratic President Harry S. Truman.
John Ehrlichman, who was an assistant to President Richard Nixon, wrote that Nixon once told him that African Americans could not really to make it available as a service of the U.S. government. Then, in March of 1972, the Commission on Population Growth and the American Future, which Nixon had created 3 years earlier with the help of congressional Democrats, began calling for the nationwide legalization of abortion.
The concept that abortion and birth control could be used to save the government money was well established by this point in history. In 1969, Joseph Kershaw, who was a researcher with the U.S. government's Office of Economic Opportunity, stated that the agency had closely studied the poverty issue and found that the single most cost-effective way for the government to address it was through family planning. In other words, through abortion and birth control. And that sort of thinking is still very much alive today. On January 25th, 2009, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, said on an ABC News program that the government's economic stimulus package should include a large increase in spending for population control. She said that this could save the state and federal governments the cost of having to pay for the health care and education of poor children. Not surprisingly, Pelosi has a 100% approval rating from Planned Parenthood.
At one time, it was common to hear politicians and elected officials openly talking about the need for population control in the black community, or saying things like $1 spent on family planning is worth $5 spent on economic development. But since we don't hear that sort of thing anymore, it would be easy to conclude that the government is not still involved in black genocide. But that's not the case. Look, it's no longer necessary for the government to be directly involved in black genocide because that's what they hired Planned Parenthood for. I mean, it can't just be a coincidence that at the same time when government population control programs were backing away from specifically targeting black neighborhoods, at that same time, the state and federal funding for Planned Parenthood was being increased by leaps and bounds. To understand the magnitude of the dollars involved here, remember this. By 1970, Planned Parenthood was already the 19th largest health-related fundraising organization in the country. But by year 2000, it had moved into third place behind only the American Heart Association and the American Cancer Society. And a major factor in that phenomenal growth was government funding. Basically, what's happened over the last 40 years or so is that Planned Parenthood has taken billions in government money while locating the vast majority of its facilities in minority neighborhoods. And that has not only been a tremendous boost for the eugenics movement, but it has also allowed government-funded family planning programs to target the black population while insulating the government from any direct connection to black genocide.
One of the places where government money has been used to advance the eugenics agenda has been in the public school system. Although government-funded population control programs can be found in white schools, the evidence is that they are significantly more likely to be targeted at black schools.
One example of this was seen in 1986, when it was discovered that Illinois public schools were not only distributing birth control to children, but that every one of the 50 facilities involved were in minority neighborhoods. When this information was made public, a local African-American pastor organized a campaign to stop the program. Reverend Hiram Crawford labeled the project Genocide, saying that the obvious goal was to go after the Hispanic and black population.
That same pattern was also found in Maryland in the 1990s. Even though the state's teen pregnancy rate was higher among white students than black students, when the contraceptive device Norplant was introduced, it was selectively marketed to children as young as 13 in predominantly black schools in Baltimore. The result was that of the first 350 girls implanted at a local middle school, 345 were African American. Then, when Norplant was approved for general distribution, Of the first 100 schools selected, all 100 were in minority neighborhoods.
The Norplant contraception device was developed by the Population Council in New York, which had been established in 1952 under the leadership of its president, John Rockefeller. Its next two presidents, Frederick Osborne and Frank Notestein, were both former members of the American Eugenics Society, and Notestein would later serve on the National Advisory Council of Planned Parenthood.
There is an element of racism in the motivation of some Americans who are promoting birth control. It's interesting to note that family planning abroad is being strongly advocated by some senators better known for their anti-civil rights position. United States Congressman Clement Zablocki, March 25, 1966.
If you're going to curb population, it's extremely important not to have it done by the damn Yankees, but by the UN. Because the thing is that it's not considered genocide. If the United States goes to the black man or the yellow man and says, slow down your reproductive rate, we're immediately suspected of having ulterior motives to keep the white man dominant in the world. If you can send in a colorful UN force, you've got much better leverage. Alan Guttmacher, president of Planned Parenthood and former vice president of the American Eugenics Society, 1970.
4 years after Guttmacher made that statement, America's National Security Council issued a report that was intended to define the United States government's official policy on controlling world population. It was called the National Security Study Memorandum 200, or NSSM 200, and it was formulated in cooperation with the United States Agency for International Development, the U.S. State Department, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency. One of its goals was to establish a strategy for reducing the populations of third world countries so that the United States could have increased access to their natural resources, particularly minerals and metals.
Among the conclusions of NSSM 200 was that no country has reduced its population growth without resorting to abortion. The authors of the report then identified 3 non-governmental agencies that would be funded to carry out the government's population control agenda in the targeted countries. One of those agencies was Planned Parenthood.
One of the tactics specified in NSSM 200 was that we might withhold food aid after a disaster if the countries do not accept the American idea of birth control. This has happened many times all over the world. One example is the Southern American country of Guyana, which was hit by a hurricane back in 1997. Now, they had turned down abortion and birth control for 12 years straight, but after the hurricane hit Guyana in 1997, the World Bank said, we will not give you any aid unless you legalize abortion and birth control. And that's exactly what they did.
Now, see, these are some horrible people, okay? Now, this is wrong. Anytime you take so much control over everybody on the planet as to where anytime a natural disaster happened on the earth, you can dictate policy to make people abide or coerce people into a political agreement that otherwise the people would not take. Or otherwise you sit back the person with all the provisions and say, well, we just won't help you out, damn. We know it's some Europeans behind there. That's capitalism. I ain't gonna waste time trying to figure out who would do some shit like that.
Seen this several times in Africa where droughts have hit, and the United Nations and USAID will not assist unless they accept birth control. I've been all through Africa myself, and I've seen medical clinics that are full of birth control devices, but no safe motherhood delivery kits. There's no anesthesia, there's not even any bandages there. There's crates and crates of birth control pills and condoms. Now, while our commitment to birth control is going up every year, our commitment to authentic economic development is dropping. So we see less clean drinking water funding, less school funding, see less medical clinic funding. Another example is Haiti. Haiti has been hit by hurricanes several times, and the United States and other countries are saturated with birth control. In Haiti now, any woman, 90% of women at least, can now get access to any kind of birth control they want to, government funded, but less than 20% of the Haitians have access to clean drinking water. Now try to imagine there being a natural catastrophe in a country like Canada or Australia or France or England. And we go in there and we say to them, we're not going to offer you any kind of aid unless you accept our philosophy on birth control and population control. That will be outrageous. But that's our standard operating procedure when we go to a black country after a catastrophe of some kind. You cannot believe that we are going to treat people in a foreign country like this and not treat our own population of African Americans the same way. Consider what happened after Hurricane Katrina. One of the first things we did was bring in birth control and contraception. And as we all know, the hurricane disproportionately affected black families in that area. And I seriously doubt if the same kind of disaster hit a middle-class white area, the first response would be common to birth control.
This idea that population control could be used to control a specific population was not unique to NSSN 200. For example,
See, this is where they're confused. That it's not about controlling us. It's about murdering us. They're not trying to control you by giving you contraceptives. They're trying to make your birth rate decline. Anytime you have one nationality of people trying to perpetuate genocide on another nationality of people by killing their children, this is the same description that was given to you in your Holy Bible about the king trying to murder the firstborn Israelite child. See, what they attempt to do is eradicate people like me from coming on the earth with sunlight information to try to return the earth, or to return the earth to a calibrated God system. That's what it's all about. That's the reason they attacked the black man, because the originality of man on this earth is the H-U-E, human. And the white man calls himself a white man, so he denies the privilege of calling himself a human himself. So that's what it's all about. It's just all about killing God. And the perpetuator of this is the ungod. In a nutshell. You could call him the Antichrist if you want to. That's a description you all have been looking for. And you don't know. He's already found you. You don't have to look for him. He already found you.
before the Nazis took power in Germany, abortion had been illegal, except to save the life of the mother. But under Hitler, the Hamburg Eugenics Court ruled that it would still be illegal for Aryan women, but legal for women of what they called inferior racial stock. According to the court, encouraging eugenic abortions would promote racial hygiene and protect the health of the German people. This new policy eventually led to certain women being threatened with execution if they refused to abort what the Nazis called racially worthless babies.
At about the same time this was going on in Germany, the government of Bermuda was blanketing the island with population control facilities and openly stating that their intent was to limit the numbers of blacks. Then in 1958, blacks in the Caribbean rebelled against a Planned Parenthood-led birth control campaign that was exclusively targeted at non-white residents, while at the same time, prosperous white residents were being encouraged to multiply. Following a similar pattern, a 1965 article in the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper reported that under apartheid, the white South African government was relying on targeted birth control as its primary weapon to reduce the number of blacks in the country.
Unfortunately, we now know that the U.S. government was not immune to this sort of thing either. When three pro-choice researchers investigated the original motives behind the creation of the abortion pill, RU-486, what they discovered was that the scientific basis for it was actually developed in the United States during the 1960s by the National Institutes of Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In their 1991 book, these researchers claimed to have found data showing that this agency was looking for an inexpensive and effective drug to control the populations of foreign countries that the government had classified as underdeveloped. The abortion pill was to be tested in these environments, and if successful, the plan called for it to then be introduced into Black, Hispanic, and Native American communities in the United States.
In 1977, only 3 years after NSSN 200 was issued, the director of the United States Office of Population, Dr. Reinhard T. Ravenholt, publicly stated that it was the U.S. government's intention to sterilize 1/4 of the world's female population. According to Ravenholt, one of the driving forces behind this campaign was the need to protect American financial and commercial interests.
Ravenholt said that some foreign governments were refusing to give the United States permission to come into their country and control their population. He said that, in those cases, the plan was to be carried out by two private organizations with an enormous amount of financial support from the American government. When asked by a St. Louis newspaper to name the two organizations, he said that they were the United Nations Fund for Population Activities and Planned Parenthood.
Among government officials who supported the Ravenholt philosophy of using American intervention to control the populations of foreign countries, perhaps the most powerful were Republican President Gerald Ford, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. In the mid-1970s, while serving as foreign policy advisor to the Ford-Rockefeller administration, Kissinger personally helped Planned Parenthood set up an abortion counseling program for Vietnam refugees who were being housed at Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Base in California. This was done despite the fact that the vast majority of these refugees were known to be strongly opposed to abortion, and not one of them had ever requested abortion counseling.
At the same time, Kissinger also refused to hold an abortion training program that was being conducted by the Agency for International Development, which operates under the direction of the State Department. Kissinger allowed this project to continue despite numerous complaints that it was in clear violation of U.S. law that specifically prohibited American foreign aid funds from being used for this purpose.
The commitment that Ford, Rockefeller, and Kissinger had for this illegal project may have been a reaction to something Reinhard Ravenholt had said a few years earlier. In 1973, he was speaking at a Planned Parenthood national conference where he told attendees that abortion may actually be the most demographically powerful way of controlling population. Ravenholt would eventually be honored by Planned Parenthood for what it called innovation and vision in the population field.
Years ago, a series of USA Today articles documented that there are large multinational corporations on the New York Stock Exchange today that actually got their start in the slave trade. But when slavery ended and Africans could no longer be financially exploited, many of those same corporations began pouring millions into the eugenics movement. The people they had found so valuable as property, they had little use for it as fellow citizens. And again, some of those corporations and foundations and institutions are still around today, and every year they still pour millions into eugenics organizations like Planned Parenthood. In fact, if you look at Planned Parenthood's donor list, it reads like a who's who of corporate America. You also have individual elitists doing the exact same thing. People like Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett, Ted Turner, and many others have used their own personal fortunes to make sure that the eugenics movement never runs short of money. Of course, if you confront these people or these corporations about their support for organizations like Planned Parenthood, they'll tell you it has nothing to do with eugenics. And if someone is naive enough to believe that, that's fine. But to me, it's like someone saying, yeah, I'll give a few $1 million a year to the Klan, but I'm not really a racist.
After the abortion pill RU-486 was approved for sale in the U.S., the controversy surrounding it kept the abortion lobby from being able to find an American company to produce it. That forced them to look for a foreign manufacturer. And after an 8-year search, a company owned by the Chinese government agreed to manufacture the drug for the U.S. market. The company's management made the decision after the Rockefeller Foundation agreed to provide financial backing for the project.
There's also another connection between Rockefeller and RU-486. At the end of World War II, the German chemical manufacturer IG Farben was identified as the company that supplied the gas used in the Nazi concentration camps. The gas was called Zyklon B, and evidence later showed that Farben's executives knew how it was being used. In fact, evidence was uncovered to indicate that Farben engineers had actually designed the gas chambers. This led to some of them being tried in Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, including genocide and slavery. Interestingly, IG Farben was a financial partner with John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil of New Jersey in a company called Standard IG Farben. In addition, within 3 months after Hitler came to power, the publicity director of Rockefeller Foundation and personal advisor to John D. Rockefeller, a man named Ivy Ledbetter Lee, was assigned the responsibility of directing public relations for I.G. Farben.
After the war, I.G. Farben would change its name to become known as Hertz AG. Today, Hertz is a gigantic multinational corporation with subsidiaries all over the world, including the United States. Ironically, one of Hertz's subsidiaries, Rusal-Uclov, is the French company that developed RU-486. In other words, the same company that produced the gas used in the Nazi death camps also produced the abortion pill that is now being used in American abortion clinics. And in both cases, there was a known connection